Hey, everybody, welcome to the Data Science Deployed podcast. I'm here with my co hosts, Jillian and Donny, and today we are talking about package management in Python. Um, so, I want to make the case that poetry is sort of where package management is going. I understand that's a controversial statement. I'm hoping we can talk about other opinions throughout the show. Um, but I'll talk a little bit about poetry, and I think I want to start by uh, sort of addressing the question of like why you should care about management in general, and sort of what are the reasons for poetry making sense in some cases. And the really scary thing in Python development, in my opinion, is when versions of packages change unbeknownst to you. And I think this doesn't even have to be a direct dependency of your project. It can be a dependency of a dependency all the way up the chain. And it can actually break your build. Or if you're a data scientist, it can change your algorithm result in a surprising way that you did not plan for or intend. And obviously, there are other solutions to this problem in Python. Virtual env is very popular, very common recommendation. Anaconda, I think, is probably the most commonly used for data science teams. But I really like Poetry. I think Poetry takes some cues from NPM, the package manager for Node.js. It creates a lock file by default, which pins every single dependency that your project depends on. It works both for Python packages and for more like Python applications. It ties a little bit of other configuration into the sort of like Poetry setup. And for people running your application and your package, they can actually still install with pip. So they don't actually need a special tool to take advantage of a project that's been set up with Poetry. So that's my high level argument for Poetry. I'm curious to hear from Jillian and Donny on this subject.
Yeah, that was a great intro, Bill.
I know, that's good. Those were some strong words though, like the one through package manager. Yeah. We could fight about this one for years. I am kind of wondering in terms of Poetry, and I think this is kind of a yes or no question, and then I'll move on from this point. In terms of comparing it to other package managers, the one that I use most frequently is Conda, and I started using Conda because it can precompile, other sources besides Python. So, the Conda package manager can presumably create a package for anything, right? It's not just Python. There's R, there's Perl, I think there's like Node.js and NPM and all that kind of thing. And one of the things that it does is it creates these precompiled binaries that don't rely upon system packages, which is very attractive for people like me because I worked on HPC for a very long time. And the whole deal with HPC is that you don't install anything as like a root software. And so we always had to compile everything from source. That was my full-time job for a while. It was an excellent gig when I was pregnant with my youngest because I would just sit there with my feet up and I would just have like my builds going. It was great. Does Poetry do anything like that, or is it just this one is just for Python?
That's a great question. My understanding is it's just for Python, and I think that is, I totally agree about Anaconda. Like that's totally a strength that, like when I was first learning Python, just getting my environment set up was a huge pain, and Anaconda just like solved that problem for me. I guess the argument for Poetry over Conda's approach to that is you can solve that piece of it, the sort of non-Python dependencies, with Docker, and if you're using Docker, you don't necessarily want the weight of Anaconda installed in your container. But I definitely understand why Anaconda is popular, and it's actually not that I think Poetry is good for every single use case, but specifically when I'm building production machine learning systems in Python, I reach for Poetry as opposed to Anaconda for that reason.
I like that perspective, Ben. How it seems like in a limited sense, Conda, before like the prevalence of Docker and containerization, Conda is really nice for not needing to build things on the system that you're deploying on. I like Docker for that reason, where like I can build the image, where I am and then deploy the image, where I'm going to run it, similar to like a conda binary. So I think that's a really great thing. Yeah, and the other thing that I like about conda, I'll use mini conda for environments, is, as Jillian mentioned, like on a remote system, I can basically put everything in a folder. Like I'm using Python 3.8. It's going in this folder in my home directory. Everything is going in this folder. It doesn't have to be like user level, that sort of thing. But yeah, I definitely like the way that I like the idea of decoupling building and deploying the build things and package management, essentially. And so I use Docker for like the build thing. And in terms of package management, I really like the idea of Poetry, of this like lock file kind of thing. And that's something I found for my purposes. I've used this different tool. It's called pip tools. But it does a very similar thing where my workflow is, you'll have your traditional requirements.txt file with Python, and I'll have this main requirements. I'll call it .in, and that will have my loose requirements, and then I'll use these pip tools, pip compile, to actually compile pinned dependencies, essentially the equivalent of Poetry's log file, where you have even the patch version, the full semver and everything, and it includes hashes, so that you make sure you download. So it's the equivalent of a log file, and I really like that flow. So yeah, I happen to be using pip tools because, again, you can pip install, but in Poetry seems similar. But I think those are the two big things for me are, being able to like not have to build the thing on the remote system, and I tend to use Docker for that, and also being sure that you're deploying like the exact versions that you tested on. So essentially, like that pinned lock file is what I pip install inside the Docker container. And yeah, I can echo you on like things breaking. Actually, this happened to me yesterday, where I was building a Docker container, my app, and it failed because I could not find GCC, which it had never needed before. But there was an upgrade to Black, the code formatter that I use for development, which ended up having a new dependency on this Python regex package, which is an improvement on the standard library one, and it has C code, so it compiles. So I needed to add an apt-get build essential to my Docker file in order for that to work.
I think you have to put improvement in quotes if it breaks your build.
Right, exactly. But what's great is that I have confidence about that now working now, because it sort of broke at the time, but then I added the thing that did it, and every time it builds, it's going to build against that lock file, and I think that's really great. Until I decide to upgrade my dependencies and see if anything changed and what breaks again. But I can choose when things break. Things can break in development, but not on redeploy. So I think it's very important.
One other, you're talking about pip tools, and I think that's another piece of it that I didn't really talk about, but it definitely is the case that, unfortunately, there's about 10 different ways to do the same thing in Python. I guess a little bit I'm hopeful that the community will standardize around an approach. And I think the reason why it probably won't be Anaconda is because web developers and other Python developers who are not doing data science don't really want to use Anaconda. They maybe would use Poetry. And so if we could all agree on Poetry, I think the world would be a better place.
But it's so hard to get like a room of software engineers to agree on absolutely anything.
Very true.
Anything at all. I have to say, I like the idea behind some of this stuff. I'm kind of thinking about like sort of when I had these hopes and dreams in the past, and they came to bite me, which is specifically, so when you have these very hard pin dependencies, at some point, somebody like revokes a version or deletes a version on PyPy, or, just like whatever kinds of things happen, and then your build completely breaks because it is too because it's pinned so much. So it's like, well, I can see how that's a good and a wonderful thing, and then I can also see how that's going to be me being up until 2 a.m. trying to figure out what happened because I have a deadline for tomorrow. So, you know, do you guys like, how does poetry kind of deal with sort of that idea of like, we want to pin things as much as we can to reproduce this environment, but we also know that this is a computer and that things are going to change. So how like flexible is it in the pinning? Is it really easy to just say, you know, upgrade this one package? Like, is that maybe something that's built in? Is there a way to roll back? Anything? I'm not so familiar with poetry, so I'm here asking me, you know, explain like I'm 5 questions.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I like I guess the first question was sort of like, how strict is it about locking? My understanding is very strict, but like from personal experience, I've had the problem where I didn't pin every single dependency and it breaks because some transitive dependency changes. I've never had the thing where an actual pin dependency just disappears from the internet. I vaguely remember this happening in NPM. It's like some random package disappeared from the repository and just broke half the internet. So I think that would be a scary thing. But my assumption is basically there are other systems in place to make sure that happens as little as possible. Like PyPy, I don't think there's an easy way to just delete your version off of PyPy once you've published it. I could be wrong about that. But it is fairly easy to update dependencies in poetry if that were to ever happen to you. So there's a pretty flexible syntax for specifying the versions that you can tolerate in the actual dependency configuration, and then you can run poetry update. I think it's called poetry update to reinstall what the configuration file says and relock it to this new set of pin dependencies. So I think that's a problem that's basically solved in poetry, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like I can definitely see it, but it makes me so uncomfortable with all the package managers that if they do need to compile something, that the compiling is happening at the install step. That just, I don't know, it makes me kind of queasy. But I think that's like more an emotional problem with me maybe than a technical problem, as some of these problems tend to be. What do you guys think about that? Because I know, Donny, you were saying a little bit ago that you had, you know, that all of a sudden you needed to pull GCC in there, which at least, you know, that's not too bad. But I mean, imagine if it had been kind of the, you know, some of the stuff that you see in the scientific Python community, like Boost, or of course now I can't think of any, or like, you know, some strange version of zlib. That's something that you see a lot in bioinformatics, or just, you know, like all these kind of different packages that you maybe need to compile against. I think that's a lot of why I like Conda. But I can also see, like, if you don't care about scientific Python, which you know, or you're not doing anything scientific, or if you're doing web development, something like this could be, like, you know, very nice.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think it is important to be able to have this platform where you're most likely to be able to compile things, and so Conda gives that to you, you know, right away. And so in my work, I'll use Docker, and like Docker is just like a mechanism. Like specifically, I'll use this. I'll usually base my images off of this Python Slim Buster thing right now, which is sort of like the latest stable Debian and a Python official Docker Python package. And so I guess I'm sort of depending on things being able to be built on Debian right now for anything, rather than my specific system. And I admit I'm not too careful with this because I haven't been bitten yet by it, but I usually don't take too care of being conservative with my pip cache or my compile cache. But I imagine that'd be the sort of thing where, you know, if I were to be bitten by that, you know, if I'm, you know, working on something and I need to get something out, and I decide I want to upgrade something and it doesn't work, I should be able to roll back to the previous pinned version of it, because it should have been built, you know, locally on my machine. I don't even need to go to the internet to get it again if I really need to get it out right there. Yeah, I haven't found that I needed to pay careful attention to that. But that's where I would like look towards is like my tip cache and my build cache, and like making sure that I I keep maybe more than I think I need, so that I can be sure to revert and not have to recompile or go out to the internet, again. Because I can imagine that being pretty concerning.
Maybe someday we'll have version control for package management systems. When we're talking about having like caches and things. Like it seems like at some point you would be able to create like different rollbacks on those. Maybe that's where they're going with this. I don't know. That would be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, imagine doing like an environment revert, like you can do a git revert, like check out like a previous version of your environment. I mean, I'm sure this probably exists, but I haven't certainly encountered it in practice, and it hasn't been streamlined. But it seems pretty neat.
I like your point about compiling dependencies. I think that's a good counter argument to my statement that you can use Poetry for everything. And to be fair, I use Anaconda on my own machine, even though I do think Poetry is nice for projects that I'm working in. Yeah, I think the other like minor complaint I have about Anaconda is the licensing changed, and I never quite know, like, am I allowed to actually install this on my machine? Am I not allowed to? Whereas a project that's totally open source is I just never have that concern.
I didn't know that about the licensing. That's interesting. What happened?
I think basically you're supposed to pay for enterprise licenses, and I don't know the details of it. So that's like, obviously basically it's just this general feeling of unease rather than it's radically changing my life. But yeah.
Okay. I should say that I typically I'll use Conda for development, but I won't use Conda inside my deployed Docker containers. I'll just because I have a Python environment, so I can just install stuff in there. I don't need to manage different things. That's interesting, though. I was reading your article on Poetry, Ben, and I do like a couple of things that seem nice. One is I didn't know that you could decouple it from environments. It tries to be helpful and create its own virtual environment, but you can say, like, forget the environment, just like give me some lock file that I can pip install wherever I am. The other thing I like about it is that I guess it's sort of like the NPM. There's sort of a distinction between main production dependencies and dev dependencies, whereas I think like my style right now is more manual, where I have like a separate requirements.txt for my main dependencies and for my dev dependencies. And I'll use the traditional like setup.py install pattern where I'll have like an extras require for those dev dependencies, whereas that's sort of all unified. It seems for Poetry for the command line, and it's all also organized together in the new PyProject TOML standard, which seems also very nice as a way of like consolidating the concerns of the traditional requirements.txt and setup.py. So I think it's going in a very good direction towards consolidating.
Yeah, I actually really like the npm package manager, and I don't do a ton of web stuff, but I am known to throw up the occasional interface and whatnot. But like I really like their package manager, and I think they did a lot of things right. And one of the things that initially I really liked about it, and actually kind of got me to learn some JavaScript, was that they had these very like project specific installations. That was the first time I ever saw that in a package manager, I think, anyways. I mean, this was a while ago, so who knows. But I remember doing like npm install, and it installed to my project directory, and like all of those dependencies were pinned to a particular project, rather than just throwing them in like user local bin, who knows, and then and then your dependencies clobber each other and things like that. So I like that direction, and I like especially having the dev and the production dependencies. I think all that is great.
And I think the way I actually don't use this feature very often, but I think the way Poetry does that is it creates its own folder of virtual environments on your machine, and then creates a new project-specific virtual environment by default each time you install dependencies for a project. So I like it's very similar in terms of functionality to npm's approach of node modules underneath the package structure.
Yep, I think that's the way that it does too. I remember. I mean, I did like try it out briefly, and then actually I found out about it a few weeks ago because I didn't know what it was, and I saw it in a build file that I was in, like a Docker build file, and I was like, "Poetry, like what is this?" You know, like what is this doing? And then I had to go. I was like, "Oh, look, it's another Python package manager." So yeah, I do think it is doing the. It creates like a home. I don't know what it is, home.local.poetry or something like that. You know, like similar to what Conda does, where I think your Conda environments end up in, you know, in like Conda ends or something like that. So it is interesting. I really want rollback on software environments. Now that this has come into my head, I'm gonna be like, that's gonna be my new, you know, my new thing that I'm stuck on is why can't I roll back? Should be able to do this.
Yeah, I mean, you can get it at the very coarse grained level if you're willing to work at that level with Docker containers, right? Like like Kubernetes. Okay, let's revert to the last image, which is like, you know, pretty good. But I mean, yeah, it'd be interesting to be able to have it at the granularity of like your Python environment level.
Yeah, I do a lot of potentially stupid things between Docker builds. So I mean, it's better than nothing, right? That's, you know, there's a very big gap here that kind of looks like Niagara Falls in terms of you know, between Docker builds when I'm building software. Oh, but I should be mentioning that online. That could be a bad thing.
I have a question that we don't have to go too far on this, but just on the, you know, we're talking about data science here, and I'm kind of curious, you know, package management isn't, and dependency pinning like isn't a solved problem even in the Python ecosystem, right? And that's just for software packages. But I'm wondering, you know, what kinds of things people have used or explored or ideas about not just installing software into your environment, but data. So if you have certain data sets that you're using as part of your analysis, you know, they might or might not be versioned, right? And so like you might have an environment where you're doing some analysis and you're bringing in 5 different data sets, and they might have different pinned versions, and they could have upstream dependencies on the upstream data sets. I can imagine that kind of thing being the case for some workflows or in the future. Yeah. Like, do people have kind of thoughts on that sort of thing? I guess you would call it.
I do too. Yeah.
Management. Okay, great.
I think we all have some pretty strong thoughts on that. Yeah, it was actually I'm a panelist on another show called Adventures in DevOps, and we were talking about that. And I think I'm probably one of the only like really data focused people. But my whole thing was, you know, the line between software and data just gets blurrier and blurrier, I think, because there are so many softwares that at the very least you need a database backend, right? So then, you know, so how are you taking care of that? You can do things like you can version your database schema with, you know, tools like SQL Alchemy or Alembic or the other ones, but it doesn't actually version the data. So if you do something like, say you make an upgrade where you're dropping a column in your database, there's no way to get that back, like with any of the currently being used tools, except for if you're doing, you know, database dumps. And it's, I mean, to me, I suppose there's a really big question of where does the line between the software end and the data begin? Because in my world, at least, there's a whole lot of gray area between those two. And yeah, I'm just wondering what you guys think about that, since I know you're sort of in a similar headspace. You know, we're all on data science deployed here.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about databases, and I'll say I haven't thought a ton about the implications of versioning data for databases, but I have thought quite a bit about versioning data for machine learning model development, and I think basically I think you can't have a reproducible model without versioning your data, and I think in the early stages of a project that's probably okay. Like just spin up your Jupyter notebook, write scratch code. You're just like in very broad strokes trying to answer basic questions about your model. But I think for a mature project, you cannot do iterative improvement on that model if it's not reproducible, and therefore you need to version your data sets. I really like data version control as a solution to this, DVC. I think I've seen other solutions out there. I don't think it's if you don't use DVC, you're not doing it right. But I do think it's very important, and I think it's not probably still getting enough attention, in my opinion, in the field, especially for sort of deployed production type machine learning systems.
So I was looking a little into DVC a little more, and I think my mental model currently is that you identify data sets using file names, and the versions are identified using hashes, and that's maybe tied to some source upstream.
Yep. File names or folders.
File names or folders.
Yep.
And so, like, I'm wondering, like, what the equivalent might be of, like, PyPy, where, like, there's maybe some sort of global namespace or repository where, like, I want to do the equivalent of pip install this data set with this global name, you know, at least relative to pypy.org, at this version number, and that corresponds to a hash, and stuff. But you can sort of maybe have like a dependencies file and pull all those things in, rather than having to like kind of there's some sense of like a publish ecosystem.
Yeah, like I want
pulling in things.
Pip install ImageNet or like whatever. Just like grab some public data set,
version, whatever.
Yep,
right.
Exactly.
Right.
I love that idea. I like, and that I don't think that's a solved problem really, but DVC does approach that. The company has a data set registry, and DVC has a command for importing data sets. So basically you can store the raw data set. They store it for you. You can import that data set, pull it down at a specific version for your project, and run from there. I've got
really
an example
like
of doing this.
I just had to take a second to say that. Like, I used to have a whole bunch of like stupid boilerplate in my make files about syncing up and down from S3, and now I can just make DVC do it, and it's great.
Yep, exactly. I've got a project doing this as a toy pipeline. It's just MNIST, but basically it's like, how do you bring in the data set? How do you manage the compute DAG, these kinds of things? So that could all be a feature or show maybe. But yeah, I think this idea is very powerful, and I hope that's where the community goes. I think a similar thing with model zoos. So model zoos are really popular in deep learning. You get this pre-trained model to start your image classifier or whatever. As far as I know, none of them are basically reproducible. So yeah, I would love to have like, here are data sets, they're all publicly available, you can import any of them, and here are our models, and here's exactly how they were trained, and you can import any of them or modify how it was trained if you want to. It's maybe a little bit academic. I don't know if it's a hard requirement for practical use cases, but it's it bugs me a little bit that we're just like, take the magic model weights out of the oven and apply them in your project, and you don't know like where they came from, or yeah, so off my soapbox, but that definitely I have thoughts about the sort of like deep learning space and how we do data sets and model versioning today.
No, I mean that's all so important. I've personally been on projects where data was lost at some point, and a lot of times it can't, you can't get it back. That's it. Like the project's over because there was some really important piece of data missing. And, maybe somebody did like a join one day and overwrote some data. I don't think any of this stuff is ever really malicious, but, things happen. Whereas if you sort of have this kind of concept of like, okay, so what goes into kind of like a data engineering platform, which is something that I've been thinking about, like what is kind of the minimum viable data engineering platform? And so much of this to me is, again, this idea of where does the software start and the data begin, or vice versa, because there is so much gray area. And I think, it's not exactly the same thing, but that's why I always keep such a close eye on all these different scientific data source models like Xarray and HDF5 and all these things, because my idea is that eventually somebody very clever is going to come along and they're going to build out like an open API kind of spec, like what exists with the, like the web open API spec, that can then be compiled to like a bunch of different sets. And what I'm hoping is that something kind of comes out of that sort of ecosystem where you have kind of like an API that can sort of access these scientific file types, and then through that you get some kind of versioning, and then you also get like your fetch and your pull and hashes and all that kind of thing. I don't know that it's happening. I know like TensorFlow kind of has something like that with their model zoo, but it's still very like platform and framework specific. I don't know if you can just take the models and like import them other places, maybe with Keras, but that's why I like this idea of like, no, we need to just sort of standardize on a few different file types within the community, throw an API, throw some kind of layer on top of those, and then just be sharing between that. And I do think things are moving in that direction, but
Yeah, shout out to the Onyx project. I think in past projects I've used Onyx ways to sort of transfer machine learning models between systems. So it's like you train a model in PyTorch, export the Onyx binary file, and then import it in DeepStream SDK or whatever. Yeah.
That's cool. I didn't know about that.
It's very cool. ONNX.
I will go take a look at that.
Yeah, just yesterday I was trying to get up a CI workflow, continuous integration workflow for testing of a code base that I'm working on a project, and the code was no problem, but it's like I can't run the test because I need to set up all these environment variables, and I need to get like the test data in, and because like all of that data is part of the project. It's part of knowing whether things are working or not. It's hard to just test the code. I mean, in the unit test sense, it's sure, but like it's part of it. So you kind of want that all to be managed together in a lot of these kinds of projects. So I definitely see that a lot. Yeah.
I also think it's really interesting to start thinking about, like this idea of sort of state, not just did it pass or fail, but something, so like I use Terraform quite a bit when I'm, committing infrastructure, and basically it's this infrastructure as code tool where essentially you have these different configuration files, but then in the back end it actually keeps track of the state. So say if I'm deploying an EC2 instance on AWS, I might call it like EC2.1 or something, and then and then I commit that and deploy it, and then I want to change the name to EC2 or something, or like EC2.1.1, EC2.2, stuff like that. It actually keeps track of all of these changes all the time with these sort of like physical entities, and kind of going through that has really sort of made me think a lot specifically about these sort of softwares that we have. That's kind of like software that also integrates with a bunch of configuration variables, like you were saying, Donny, or maybe like some test data sets or something like that. And how can we start to think about these ideas of state? Like if say you're taking Airflow. I deploy Airflow all the time, right? Airflow has a Flask application that has, I don't even know how many different configuration variables, a Redis queue, and a Postgres. So think about how many different permutations there are of just different ways that you could configure that. And that's without even getting into like free text variables, just even some of the yes, no, 1, 2, 3, stuff like that. And that's part of the application, and that's often part of the data. So how do you differentiate between versioning the software itself versus versioning like how it's deployed and the data that it's deployed with? Because you could get very different results, based on your application configuration or based on the data. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I like using test environments for that. So it's like I've got a whole test setup for Airflow and a production setup for Airflow, and I can, as I make a change, I can push it to the test setup with all those environment variables set. It doesn't solve all the permutations of different configuration settings, but it is like one realistic setting that is important, and if it breaks there, then it's going to break in production. But I don't think I have a full solution other than like that's one sanity check that I've seen work pretty well in the past.
Well, nobody has a full solution. That's what's interesting about it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've liked for a little while, at least on the side of it, we discussed software and software packages. So I've been doing pip tools and requirements.txt and pinning for that. And we've talked about dataset versioning. I do something different than DVC for that, but it sort of falls in that space of having that kind of involved in your repository for your different partitioning of environments. I think recently for me, for environment variables, I've been following the kind of approach of having like a .env file or equivalent for my different environments, so that you kind of have like a set of things and you can sort of swap them in. And when I'm developing, I'll pass one of those env files to Docker Compose services. So like things will kind of load up with kind of okay, that code and that environment and those sorts of connections. But so it's hard to reproduce the state, but at least I've kind of got these different things in the repository. Or I mean, in some cases they can't be. They need to get ignored because they contain sensitive things, and so I still haven't figured out that sort of thing. But that's how I've been juggling that sort of thing. But it's not super satisfying, I would say, because it's still sort of different systems. I've got the system for software pinning and for data pinning and for environment variable management, but like it's all part of the same thing. They just have different labels. Some of the things are software, some of the things are data, some of the things are environment, but they're all the things that need to come together.
Exactly, you can't separate them out. Do you guys mock out your your environments for testing, or do you like duplicate? So if you're, I don't know, like I'm deploying to Kubernetes, do you like mock out your Kubernetes APIs? I don't know why anybody would do that. That was a silly example. But or you see it a lot in web programming. They'll try to like mock out the different APIs and stuff like that. Or do you just be like, no, Kubernetes prod, Kubernetes stage, Kubernetes dev?
I don't mock it out as much as I probably should. Yeah, I use .env as well, so I like that for at least communicating. Like I'll have like a .env .example, and it's like, okay, these are the environments variables you're gonna have to set. Yeah. I'm not gonna commit .env, but these are the things you're gonna have to think about. Yeah, I like mocking, but it's slow, and it's for a lot of the machine learning stuff I write. I don't see a ton of benefit. I end up just testing assumptions about the data set or these other things that I don't know. I think testing data science code is hard in general.
It definitely is. I'm on the other side with mocking. I've gotten to the point I've just refused to do it, because then mocking the system turns into a bigger development project than just replicating the system. And I'm like, listen, I don't care if you want to save $70 by not having another EKS cluster up. We need one more for stage. So I've gotten kind of dogmatic over that in the last year. No, I'm just I'll scale it down, right? It doesn't have to be hundreds of nodes or whatever, but it's gotta be the same thing. I'm not gonna use Minikube or any of these other kind of systems. I think now you can run Kubernetes with Docker or something. No, it's going to be a proper Kubernetes cluster. If I'm using EKS, it's going to be EKS, all that kind of stuff.
I tend to agree with that. Yeah, and the things I do, especially if you get into more complex setups, it's unclear that you're making the right assumptions in your mocking decisions that actually reflect how things are going to perform in the real setup. So it might be better to do the real thing, but maybe subset it. So maybe your development or staging will be on a subset of the data, or it requires fewer nodes, but it's still fundamentally the same setup. So you're able to exercise assumptions that you're not able to really make, you don't really know about.
Yeah, the other thing that I like about that system, and I know I keep going on about Kubernetes, I'm not even necessarily happy that Kubernetes won the cluster war, but it's it's where we're at and it's what I'm dealing with. So Kubernetes it is, but it has a very nice integration with Terraform, where you can save all of your Kubernetes state. It gets saved within Terraform. So if you want to save environmental variables, secrets, encryption key, just whatever it is that you're doing, it becomes a part of that state. And presumably you can roll back and forth between your different commits. Whether or not that actually works is always a little bit tricky. If you're really good and you keep really everything in the Terraform state, and you don't have anything outside of that, which of course is very difficult to do because you always find some kind of little edge case. It does seem like it is a very nice way of doing things, because you are saving that sort of metadata information. But even that's for configuration. That's not even for data. That's Yeah, I mean, you could still be connecting to a database, and the database could be full of stuff, or it could have nothing, and it doesn't know. Are you guys ever on Kubernetes at all? Do you do any of your? I know, like machine learning, it seems like they've kind of hit on Kubernetes as like the Kubeflow, and like I know Prefect is using Kubernetes quite a bit for their like setup and orchestration and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, we used Polyax on my last job, which is a machine learning development platform that sits on top of Kubernetes. And then we had our batch schedulers that we used Argo, which sits on top of Kubernetes. Yeah, I don't love it. I think for most of the stuff that I care about, the sort of standard AWS tools are good enough. Like I like AWS Batch pretty well. Yeah, I think SageMaker does a pretty good job with sort of machine learning development process. But I understand why it's important, and I think for some cases it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, same here. One of my clients is we're running a Kubernetes cluster, and it's managed through Rancher, which is has a nice UI and nice way of managing Kubernetes clusters. And so we're doing stuff on that. But yeah, I mean, personally, I like the simplicity of Docker Compose and Docker Swarm and that sort of thing, and I kind of am able to get away with that when I have not too many large nodes. But I definitely appreciate the utility of Kubernetes, especially for like a large base where my clients' organizations supporting lots of different apps, and so it's nice to have the different namespaces and the ingress and certificate management, and it's the idea of the workloads and the pods, and I think it makes sense when you're dealing with that scale, especially if you're an IT support organization for a lot of people giving access to compute in that case. So yeah.
Cool. I was just wondering what you guys were thinking about it. So I think we started off the show with poetry. Does anybody have kind of anything to add to that? We got real off track there. That's okay though.
I think based on this, I might try poetry for my next project. I definitely look forward to the day when at least in Python things are a bit more straightforward. I was onboarding someone to my project 2 days ago, and they're like, "So where's the requirements.txt?" And I say like, "Okay, no, I have a requirements folder that has like a main.in and a main and a dev.in that compiles to the pip compile, and this is how we do it here." But I imagine that's the sort of same thing for a lot of people seeing probably a PyProject TOML. They're like,
100%, yeah.
Yeah, no, that was
but
me
I like
weeks ago with seeing poetry in a Docker build. I was just like, what is this? Where is the requirements.txt? That's funny because that was my exact reaction to that scenario. I was like, oh no, what's happening? Does anybody know? Is it getting kind of integrated with pip? Like when you do, so like pip or PyPy is like sort of the main thing. Can you just install?
Yeah, you can.
Can you set up a Python package with a poetry?
Yep.
Like
the
specification instead of requirements?
Yep. The PyProject.toml, you can pip install from that. Poetry adds some poetry specific stuff in there, so I think maybe not every single configuration that you might use in poetry would work in pip directly, but I think the idea is it should pretty much be compatible. Yeah, I think basically that's a problem in Python right now is there's not widespread standardization about how you actually install packages. And I don't know if poetry is going to win. I hope something wins. I think poetry is at least worth taking a look at it. I'll plan to keep using it for production projects for the near future, at least.
Cool. Well, that's a good endorsement.
Yeah, and there's definitely been progress on the front. Like I know a couple of people who've worked with the Python Software Foundation to improve PIP's dependency resolver recently. There was kind of like a major release. So there's a lot of just great work happening around just the whole ecosystem. So I'm bullish on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think once kind of enough of these sort of, things get out there, because I mean, that's sort of the beautiful thing about open source is that everybody's free to contribute their ideas. And then I think eventually they sort of converge to like something like a singularity, but it's built off of, the ideas and the work of all of these other things. It's not like it just comes out of a vacuum. So I think it's always really important that everybody, release all their things, even though sometimes I'm like, oh no, why is there another one? But, at the end of the day, I think that it's great that everybody is out there and trying to solve these problems. And, it's only making things better as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Briefly on that, I've also taken to in some of my projects using a makefile for things to interface to the various things. So like rather than having to know to type poetry, whatever, or pip, whatever, I just like make.
I like make. It's
I'm
never
bullish
going
on
away.
it now. I'm making like a cookie cutter that so one of the things that I do is I have like a couple different Docker Compose like stacks that I use pretty regularly, and I've been sort of like just manually making the make files as I go along. And now I think I'm gonna make like a cookie cutter that generates the Docker Compose and then like looks at the Docker Compose file for the services and then generates like make commands for each one of those. So like, dev airflow up, dev airflow shell, dev airflow logs, like things like that. So yeah, I'm still going. I'm still on there with the make file stuff. But I really do like it. It's great. The what is it? The cookie cutter pie package or pie data, they both have pretty nice make files with them. I just need more.
All right. So who wants to take us away?
I guess I can.
Yeah.
I think basically that's all we have to say about poetry. Give it a look if you haven't seen it already. You don't need to reject Anaconda. Both can coexist. And thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.